So the key words are coming out here in Kierkegaard. Self, relation that relates to itself, despair, and freedom. Yes, freedom. If we skip around a little bit in this book, skip ahead a little bit. Take a look at page 59. I'll be backtracking, going back and forth at this point. The idea is to read the book. Please read the book. There's no value in looking at any of these videos unless you're actually reading the book. The videos are merely meant to be a guide and an enhancement to your reading, which is the most important part. But he makes a remark at the top, page 59. It starts, "It must be possible to find out the forms of despair by reflecting on the factors which constitute the self as a synthesis. The self is made up of infinitude and finitude, but this synthesis is a relation, and a relation which, though derived, that is, though created, relates to itself, which is freedom. The self is freedom." So, the relation that relates to itself is free, and is free because it relates to itself. The self, he doesn't say the self is free. He says the self is freedom. So that our peculiar circumstance here in the universe is that we are self-conscious and therefore free beings, or we are free beings and therefore self-conscious beings, since for Kierkegaard it means much the same thing. And that notion that we are free and that at the same time that is a merit and can lead to defects is our result of our being let go of by God. Again, very ambivalent thing. God let go of us. So should we be angry with God? Should we be grateful to God for letting go of us, for making us free beings? Maybe and maybe not. It's because we're free beings, it's clear from this opening part of the book, that we are beings that are in despair, or beings that are capable of despair. Because let me say once again that in Kierkegaard's mind, no one is in despair accidentally. We choose to be in despair in one form or another, at least in the most acute forms of despair. And that is the paradox perhaps at the heart of the book. Why would anyone choose to be in despair? And hopefully, as we move through, Kierkegaard has an answer to that. Maybe we could say a few things in this section. I'm looking from 47 to 51 here, where he talks about despair and talks about the despair of not wanting to be oneself, the despair of wanting to be rid of oneself, and this despair of wanting to be oneself. Now, first of all, despair. Now, despair means hopelessness. Despair does not mean being sad or being depressed. Despair means believing that one is in a completely hopeless situation. So that when we despair over something, it's something that we can't change, that we can't do anything about. So to despair over being oneself, that is, in despair to want to rid ourselves of ourselves, is a truly to be in despair, because you can't do that. I mean, you can't get rid of yourself. As he says in the section on page 49 about the person who wants to be Caesar, what he cannot bear is that he cannot be rid of himself. That is, we're despairing over ourselves. In despairing over something, he says a little bit farther up on page 49, he was really despairing over himself, and he wants now to be rid of himself. Now, if we contrast that, as he does on page 50, with the other sort of despair, the despair of wanting in despair to be oneself, and that's really odd, because I think the other form of despair, the despair of not wanting to be yourself, in one form or another, that's a familiar experience, at least if you're a teenager. In the sense we're all teenagers still. That is, you look in the morning at that face, And boy, you really wish you weren't that person sometimes. So we're kind of familiar with that, but what's stranger is to hear someone say to despairingly want to be yourself, because we are encouraged to be ourselves, right? We are encouraged to be yourself. So how can that be a form of despair, to want to be oneself? I think that a little light is shed on what Kierkegaard means if we look at the bottom half of page 50. Just about the middle of the page, he says, "A person in despair wants despairingly to be himself." Remember, this is hopelessness. You can't be yourself, right? But surely, if he wants despairingly to be himself, he cannot want to be rid of himself. Yes, or so it seems. But closer observation reveals the contradiction to be still the same. The self which, in his despair, he wants to be, is a self he is not. Indeed, to want to be the self he truly is the very opposite of despair. That is, he wants to tear his self away from the power which established it. But despite all his despair, this he is incapable of doing. Despite all his despairing efforts, that power is the stronger, and it compels him to be the self he does not want to be. But then this is still wanting to be rid of himself, rid of the self that he is, in order to be the self he himself has chanced upon. To be self in the way he wants to be it, that would be, even if in another sense just as despairing, everything he desired. But to be forced to be self in a way that he doesn't want to be, that is the torment, not being able to be rid of himself. So there's a lot of ambiguity between the two forms of despair. That is, the despair of not wanting to be yourself and the despair of wanting to be yourself. And what is it that complicates the situation? Well, I think lurking in the background here is God, so to speak. That is, the notion that in wanting to be ourselves, we want to be the self that we want to be, as opposed to the self we really are, is only made possible because I think that there is a self that is a created self, that is, in a sense, the self that is the most fundamentally true self that we are. And that's only possible if God, in some way or another, is there, because what it's saying is that we are not totally self-created, that we have to we can't just be whoever we want to be, or we can try to be whoever we want to be, and that, Kierkegaard is saying, is indeed a form of despair. And in being the self, or in attempting to be the self, or wanting to be the self that we want to be, he characterizes that as wanting to tear ourselves away from the power which established us. That is, to be self-created, to assert ourselves in the most fundamental way, that this is the self we really are. This is because it's the one we want to be. But that power, he says, is the stronger, and it compels him to be the self he does not want to be. So this is, again, going back to the decision about whether there is a God or not, and the implications of the decision of what sort of world you want to live in, the godless world or the world with God, is that if you lived in the world with God, and the situation, as far as who you are, becomes very complicated, because there are barriers in terms of our self-assertion and our self-creation. We cannot simply be the selves that we want to be. We may have to acknowledge a more powerful reality, even in terms of who we really are, and that, Kierkegaard, as we'll see, that sets up the purest forms of despair. So being a self, being a free being, is not always a happy thing. And he ends this section on page 51 by saying, "And this eternity must do, because having a self, being a self, is the greatest, the infinite concession that has been made to man, but also eternity's claim on him." That is, being a self is not all great, it's not all good, it's not all happiness. And now we'll move on to Kierkegaard's idea of different forms of despair.